Hi everyone, my name's Nathaniel and let's get started. I'm using Zoom to record this presentation, so I'm going to share my screen with you now. I'm affiliated with Kindai University in Higashi Osaka, Japan. And in today's presentation, I'm going to be exploring, number one, narratives of Japan and Japaneseness, one of purity and homogeneity versus one of hybridity. Two competing narratives within Japanese society. I'm drawing on Horner's conceptualization of this. Horner was talking about Luxembourg, I believe. Number two, I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about approaches to criticality in applied linguistics and language education with a focus on Japan. And due to time constraints, I won't be able to go into great detail. But I will give you an idea of how to be thinking about what you read in critical scholarship and in critical scholarship paying attention to Japan. Number three, how does critical scholarship align with and or challenge narratives of Japan and Japaneseness? And then number four, where might criticality go? So the first narrative I want to present to you is one that maybe many of you are familiar with, and that is that Japan is a site of homogeneity or purity. So this quote is from Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Taro Aso, who said this year, "There is no other nation but Japan where a single race has spoken a single language at a single location and maintained a single dynasty with a single emperor for over 2,000 years." So history through this lens is presented as the linear story of one people characterized by sameness, linguistically, culturally, ethnically, and so on, even physiologically, whose isolation by water has led to their deep distinctiveness. And through this story of history, we see allowance for periodic periods of opening and then closing again. So the idea is, yes, it's a linear history. Yes, there was contact with people from other places, but generally there was little contact, and Japan developed distinctively separate from others, separated by water. The Meiji period is a key point where we see Japan opening up, where Americans arrive through this lens, open Japan forcibly, and Japan has to confront movement, change, diversity, and hybridity. Now, the influence of this narrative on education is obviously large. It's what it was originally political, economic, and academic has become social and mainstream. And so this has affected the way that communication or connection with others and the idea of becoming a global human resource, or gurobaru jinzai in Japanese, how that's been imagined. And so English education has generally been based on the idea of juxtaposing a homogenous Japan vis-a-vis the world beyond, and that interaction with others involves English. This idea of English as the exclusive tool to connect with people has become increasingly strong since World War II. It's not always been thought of that way, but definitely has become that way. And Japanese plays no role in being a global human resource, according to this narrative. And so the idea is to become native-like, which we all know here from this slide what that means. To become native-like, to communicate with people from different backgrounds. Diversity and complexity is outside Japan. Japan is characterized by homogeneity. Now, there's an alternate narrative of history, and that is one of movement, diversity, and hybridity. That Japan has always been a site of movement and change and expansion and contraction and diversity and hybridity. I have a slide here. You can read through it, pause the video, but I don't want to talk 1,000 kilometers an hour. So what I can say is what we see here is linguistic, cultural, socioeconomic, ethnic, religious, and so on, diversity within Japan. How many of you know that Japan officially has, according to the UN, 9 languages? 6 of those in the Ryukyus, the now Okinawa Prefecture and Southern Kagoshima Prefecture. How many of you knew that? That they are positioned now as dialects of Japanese for socio-political reasons by the Japanese government to maintain the narrative that Japan is monolingual. So we can see, and I hate to point out little bits of diversity to prove that Japan is diverse, but these people, these things, are part of the diverse, beautiful, complex fabric of what it means to be Japanese and a member of Japanese society, past and present. Now, transdisciplinary scholarship, work in history, genetics, archaeology and anthropology, and history, for example. Did I say history? And social movements within Japan have documented history. They've documented the flows of people and ideas and goods and information and technology. And in doing so, have identified this purity narrative as a product of the formation of a shared national identity, essentialized and idealized in the Meiji period, meant to unite and control the population. Now, talking about this formation of a shared national identity could take years. What I can say is this involved the construction of a national language and the marginalization of other dialects of Japanese and the languages of the Ryukyus, which, mind you, are part of the family of languages called Japonic, but are not dialects of Japanese. Nevertheless, there was the creation of a shared or a family registry that united people in units and bound them to place and then connected them with the emperor. We had efforts at talking about where the quote unquote Japanese people came from. So some eugenics and social Darwinism involved, and the eventual construction of what has been referred to by Sugimoto as the NEC equation, nationality plus ethnicity plus culture equals Japaneseness. So not simply a passport, but blood or spirit or culture. So number 2, this work and social movements have looked at how history telling and belonging have been imagined and whose voices and lived experiences have been privileged or silenced in this process. Very little of which, or almost none of which, is taught, for example, in school. Now, some people have described the homogeneity narrative as one of myth. But one important thing that Burgess says I think is important to understand is that this has become a social reality and a lens through which many people see their own identity and holds great significance. And it's a reality referred to by many outside Japan as well. Oh, Japan is homogenous. Very common thing to hear from people. And I've encountered in my own experiences when people have told me that, why do criticality in Japan? It's homogenous. Well, let's talk briefly about lenses within applied linguistics and language education scholarship. Now, there has been a lot of work looking at identity and community membership globally. Due to the origins of the field of English language education or language education in general, and the colonial ongoing colonialism and neoliberalism. But let it just be said that this work has also been going on in Japan, looking at identity and community membership, privilege and marginalization, and inequity that manifests within, for example, ELT, um, and beyond for some scholars. So one of the key questions that I would ask looking at this work is, number one, how does it attend to the broader discussions or transdisciplinary and social movement oriented discussions of privilege and marginalization and inequity, of identity negotiation and community membership negotiation? And number two, in terms of Japan, what narratives do these critical lenses align with? Now, I've written a couple of books with my friends trying to cover very simply the lenses through which people have approached identity, experience, privilege and marginalization, and inequity, and how to attend to those things. Let it just be said here. I'm not sure why I said that expression twice. One of the first common lenses we see in work focused on Japan and also international is this lens that I would call the lens of juxtaposed nativeness, where scholars are not actually problematizing idealized nativeness in English, but rather arguing that teachers, native and non-native, can be two separate species who work symbiotically together, who benefit each other with their strengths and weaknesses. And so the idea through this lens is that native speaker teachers, quote unquote, are not local speakers of the local language, but they're native speakers. And local nests, quote unquote, are native speakers of a local language. They've learned English, they can sympathize with students. We're not problematizing the idealized nativeness, right? The target for learning through this lens. Although this is a very common type of work that you'll see when you encounter critical scholarship. Even though many people have moved beyond this, it's actually quite common to see still and popularized still by many scholars. The second one is what I'm just going to call here the addressing idealized nativeness in English lens. We understand that there are many users and contexts and varieties and functions of quote unquote English, for example. We understand the history of colonialism that is ongoing. It's not ended. And neoliberalism. We understand these things, and we are seeking to move beyond idealized nativeness and to challenge the idea of privileging a certain type of nativeness grounded in Western whiteness and all of the things associated with that. And so through this lens, most often we use categories to apprehend and approach identity and experience and inequity. So we talk about native speakers being privileged, non-natives being marginalized, the lens, as Mahmoud has talked about, the Otherness lens, the idea of kind of being multilingual, multinational, multicultural, being associated with being Otherness. More recent work has looked at challenging this category of nest, because there are certainly many ways to be a nest, a native English speaker teacher. And so looking at privilege and marginalization, yet still using the theory of native speakerism. Native speakerism is the key word here, a key concept. The idea that natives are privileged, non-natives are marginalized. This is ubiquitous. It's categorical. We can use this term to talk about all people's experience in a specific context. Although, like I said, this is being challenged increasingly. I feel in the work that I'm seeing, conversations about native speakerism are shifting towards talking specifically about a group of people, white, Western people, or people who are positioned that way, And so it's shifting away from the idea of native speakers are privileged and towards white native speakers, teachers, regardless of background, are privileged, and this is ubiquitous, and it unfolds, and it has originated from the same source, the same kind of privileged source historically. And so this is what we might call the N-nest lens. And so the word native speakerism is employed as part of this, although it means, as I just said, different things to different people. Now, both the first lens and the second lens problematize the monolingual principle, the idea that English would be taught monolingually, as well as the native speaker fallacy, Phillipson's native speaker fallacy, that native speaker teachers are the only and the ideal teachers. Now, when we go to the third lens, and this is an emergent lens where scholars are looking at moving beyond idealized nativeness in English, but that involving looking at broader negotiations of identity and community membership, and the idea that categories don't help us achieve that. So key arguments are, number one, categories cannot account for individuals' negotiations of being and belonging, and they're stripped of voice. So how can we talk about, for example, in my own work, looking at a department where we have quote unquote Japanese teachers who are the majority in the department, and then a handful, or maybe one or two, quote unquote native speaker teachers who are white and Western, quote unquote, but from very different backgrounds. For example, Ireland versus the United States. And then the teachers who are absent. And then the fact that within the category of Japanese, the diverse experiences of people negotiating identity and membership personally and professionally. How do we account for all these different ways of being and belonging if we're utilizing categories to do so? Number two, individuals may experience fluid privilege and marginalization, and this is a sensitive topic. They are not separate, that they can happen. Part of the story of negotiating being and belonging is that people can experience fluid privilege and marginalization. Number three, that critical explorations of these things should be situated within larger societal negotiations of self and otherness. In other words, if we're looking at privilege and marginalization and the negotiation of identity and community membership in Japan, can we avoid talking about Japan's history and narratives of identity and community membership negotiation? And finally, as I just said, addressing inequity involves much more than simply talking about nativeness in English. Is addressing native speakerism going to address the root reasons and discourses that give shape to privilege and marginalization within, for example, Japanese society? And Pennycook mentions how the issues we face are transdisciplinary. In other words, rather than simply using work within a silo, within a field, drawing on scholarship and voices that transcend those spaces in order to address contextualized socio-historical needs. Now, the criticisms here we see are from this, through this lens, are that the first two lenses I mentioned do not address the idea of homogeneous Japan. They leave it untouched and reinforce the idea that movement and diversity and hybridity are newish things. So the world is diverse and complex, but Japan historically has not been. Additionally, the neoliberal centrality of English has not been addressed. And this scholarship mentions that criticality can and does serve as a vehicle, Trojan horse, for the promotion of nationalistic discourses like homogeneous Japan. So where might criticality go? Question one, Can privilege and marginalization be understood apart from talking about the negotiation of identity in community membership? If our work is detached from that, don't we leave the nature and origin of manifested privilege and marginalization partially or wholly unaddressed? Now, Spivak says, strategic essentialism can be a way of organizing and addressing inequity, no doubt. It can afford that. At the same time, as a worldview in theory, it can silence and erase identity and experience. It can other. And one final question, if we're seeking to account for the rich complexity of the world we live in, should we not attend to identity and experience in similar ways? And if we're not doing it, why? What agenda is driving us not doing that? And so I leave you here with my reimagining criticality and a quote from one of my recent articles. Thank you so much. And I wish you health and happiness. Be well and have a good one.